Donald Trump, and I think, well, we suppose that this will be over in January after today, and then in a couple of weeks. James is professor at the University of Texas in Austin and has worked a lot, and I don't need to introduce so much of you, on inequality, on all these questions. And you've driven a project and led a project on the question of a Green Deal, Green New Deal. We've been discussing all this a lot. And as we followed all this from Germany, at some point it seemed very exciting to listen to what's happening in the US in this respect, which is a whole new ideas of what could be a Green New Deal. Then it seemed as if the Democrats have chosen a candidate which is more on the side to be sure to win and not to be very ambitious on this side. But in the end, it seems as if there have been a lot of Democrats from the more progressive side who have supported Joe Biden. And in the end, we now would like to reconsider this question on what is to be expected. There's a huge program which Joe Biden has promised to do in the election campaign. So all this taken together, and bearing in mind that we are in a phase which implies some political uncertainty, and you will probably talk about it. And everyone knows that there is still a very important decision in the election at the end of January, and which will be decisive on how powerful the new president will be. But bearing this in mind, we are very excited to have you and get your insights and your feelings about what will happen and what can happen, and in which respect we can expect some new economic policies in the US, because we also will have some elections next year, and there will be a lot of discussions around this, and it will influence and will have a huge impact on what will be discussed in Germany, I think. So thanks a lot, James, and please, you accepted to give us some introduction, and then we have a discussion with the people online. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to speak relatively briefly. I'm trying to keep it to about 15 minutes, and then open it up to whatever questions you have. I take the general thrust of the invitation was to assess the prospects for a turn toward a substantially more progressive policy in the United States on economic matters, but especially on climate matters. And I have to tell you that so far as I can tell from the way things are going, the prospects are not very good. We can trace out the arc of American politics over the course of the past year. And what it has amounted to, in my view, is the essential, in the first instance, the essential elimination of the insurgent left as an organized political force in the United States. This happened over the course of the primaries with basically two primary sources. One is the extreme antagonism that the establishment of the Democratic Party has toward the left wing of the party. That goes back many, many years, but it was evident in 2016, was evident this year. They coalesced behind Joe Biden as the nominee as a way of making sure that there were no substantial inroads from the Sanders camp. And secondly, I think there was an element in which over his evolution in two cycles as a presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders came substantially less focused on the very narrow set of economic propositions that motivated him in 2016. He yielded to pressure to widen his appeal to the left Democratic base, and as a result lost voters on the other side of his constituency, or the basically working class voters. As a result, didn't expand his base beyond what it had been in 2016 on average. So between those two things, that force was essentially eliminated. And you can see a modest shift to the left in the center of gravity of the Democratic Party, but it's very modest, and absolutely no concessions on personnel have been made at the senior level of the appointments coming into the Biden administration. Essentially complete exclusion of the progressive wing of the party. The election itself, quite predictably, although it was not predicted for all the usual reasons, was essentially a replay of the election of 2016 with a very slight variations. And the major variation was that a certain number of white male voters who had not been willing to vote for a female candidate in 2016 were willing to vote for a male Democratic candidate in 2020. That's what made the difference. Trump picked up every votes share in every other demographic: women, minorities, Hispanics, blacks. But in the white male demographic, he lost about 5 percentage points. So that essentially explains the outcome and explains why 3 states which voted for him in 2016 shifted back to the Democrats in 2020. And I'll give you just a very quick analysis of the economics of this for those who are interested in how the Electoral College works and how party affiliation works in the United States. A young colleague of mine, Jae-hee Choi, and I calculated out the change in inequality, economic inequality in the United States, in the states of the United States, which are the decisive forces in the Electoral College, compared to the electoral votes, which are blue diamonds for the Democrat, red circles for the Republican. And what you can see plainly is that the states with the highest increases of inequality are the states that are dominated not by the Republicans, but by the Democrats. Why is that? Because the Democratic Party is essentially a bimodal party. It's based upon urban professionals who are relatively high income and low income minority communities. And those two add up to a majority of the state: California, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut. Then you have a Democratic state. In the states which are substantially suburban and rural, you have Republican states. Now, Biden picked up some of the states that had a lower increase of inequality, but essentially the pattern is extremely clear, and it's the dominant one in the way votes are allocated, or voting patterns exist in the United States to this point. And that's not going to change. That's something which has been becoming more and more pronounced as the elections go by. And you could even see here that one of the states that Biden picked up somewhat unexpectedly, Georgia, in this election is one of the sort of ones on the margin, whereas a very close states, North Carolina and Florida, are just on the margin on the other side. So anyway, I don't want to belabor that point, just to give you an idea of how American voting patterns are exceedingly stable and based upon the underlying political economy of the two parties. The control of the Congress was the outcome in the congressional races was a deep disappointment for the Democrats, although again, not entirely unpredictable. In 2018, the Democrats had won a large number of seats. Characteristically, in the first mid-year election of a presidential term, the incumbent party loses seats. That happened. And in the next 2 years, they lost some of them, and result have a much smaller majority than they had in between 2018 and 2020. And they did not pick up the seats in the Senate that arithmetically they probably should have, given that there were many more Republicans exposed than Democrats. And of course, the outcome in the Senate will not be determined until there is a runoff election in Georgia on the 5th of January. But at the very best case, from the Democratic standpoint, they'll have 50 seats plus the vice presidency to settle ties in the Congress. It will, in short, not be a 2-year period in which the Democrats control anything like a commanding majority in order to make major policy initiatives, even if they were inclined to do so. And given the alignment of the personnel, there's no particular reason to think that they're going to try anything. They'll try a few things, but there will be something on the order of a Green New Deal, with all of that implies in terms of particularly the New Deal aspect of this, with a major experimentation and reform. Neither the political control is there, nor is the inclination on the part of the leading elements in the incoming administration. In fact, the topic is essentially not discussed. The term does not come up. It has now been basically relegated to a slogan that was remembered from the early days of the primary campaign. That's not to say the administration will do nothing. Of course, personnel will change. Administration will be substantially improved in important ways. The president has a certain number of powers that he can exercise by executive order, and he will do that up to a point. Although he made very clear to the civil rights leaders a few days ago that he is not inclined to do that to stretch the presidential powers that he might have. In terms of what will happen to the economy under these circumstances, a very interesting question. The economy it's obviously subject to the enormous shock of the pandemic, from which it was buffered by very large actions that were taken in March, April of last year. And those actions, which involved pumping out quite a lot of money to both the corporate sector and the household sector, are now essentially wrapped up and have not been replaced. Whether they will be replaced in the lame duck section of Congress is still very much under discussion. The prospects at the moment do not look very good, although anything can happen up to a certain point. And whether anything will happen in the new administration is really a question of the balance of power in the United States Senate, which is not favorable to the Biden administration. If the Republicans make a decision, which they did in the Obama years, that they're essentially aiming to sabotage the administration, make sure it can do as little as possible in the hopes that the voters reject it, as they did Obama in 2010, although he won re-election in 2012. Then they follow that strategy. Then it looks to me that we will see the unfolding of the economic consequences of the pandemic that were deferred a bit by the actions of March, April of 2020 over the course of 2021. And there will be a balance between that and the speed with which and the effectiveness of the vaccine campaign to put the pandemic back in and bring it to an end. At the moment, I may be a touch too pessimistic on this, but I'm seeing at least 6 months before that becomes a reality. And in 6 months, a great many things will simply continue to decay. You can see this in every American town. Boarded up storefronts and people who are idled and people living increasingly on. There will be an increasing problem of people being evicted because Biden may extend it, probably will, but protections against foreclosures and evictions are expiring at the end of this year. And you're going to see the humanitarian consequences of the fact that people's debts are continued to accumulate while their incomes have been sustained essentially by government aid, which is now coming to an end. So it does not look to me like it's a very cheerful prospect. Against that, there may be some substantial reserve savings, which could be kicked back into the economy as the public health situation eases, if it does. But whether those will really be available, if people will be willing to use them, is just, to my mind, a very, very much open question. The question then is what the long-term political future is. The Republicans will be looking to define themselves in the post-Trump era around a very strong electoral base that they continue to maintain. The Democrats are faced with a very interesting set of problems because their base, while they do have certain demographic advantages moving their way through the South and Southwest of the country, they've not succeeded in renewing the leadership of the party. And the incoming president, of course, is the oldest one who's ever taken office in the history of the United States. And the extent to which he will hold up over 4 years is, of course, a question that's open to anybody who's 78 or 79 years old, particularly in that kind of demanding job. So we'll see. In 2-4 years, I would not be at all surprised to see a revanche of the far right in the United States, and perhaps under someone who is politically more of a competent figure, maybe less flamboyant. Hard to be more flamboyant than the exiting president, Mr. Trump. Okay, so that's about 15 minutes. I think that's enough to give you something to chew on, and I'm happy to spend the rest of the time taking questions and seeing what I might know that might be of interest to you.
Thanks a lot, thanks very much, James. I would immediately invite everybody in a Zoom session to raise your hands and tell.
Hold on.
If you want to raise a question.
Sorry, my sound system has failed momentarily.
Okay. Hello.
I'm going to go offline for a second, and I'll be with you momentarily.
Okay. Maybe we can collect some questions. Are there immediate feedbacks, questions on what James just has prepared, has talked about? Marc, wir können auch, glaube ich, alle reinnehmen, oder?
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that.
Okay, so everything's fine. We're back. Thanks again for your presentation. I would very much like to start on the diagnosis of what has happened in the election. The chart that you showed was about the inequality index, or was it a change from?
It was the change of inequality from 1989 to 2014, measured across each state of the United States. And that's only of interest because the states allocate their votes through the Electoral College. So this turns out to be a very effective way to figure out how the lie of the land from the standpoint of the states in terms of their political orientation. Once you understand what the Democratic Party is economically, what the Republican Party is, the Republican Party is the party in the middle of the income distribution. The Democrats are the party at the two extremes. The Republicans obviously do have a super coterie of very wealthy people, but by and large, where they're electorally dominant is in places which are suburban, rural, small towns. And that's in the middle of the American income distribution, not at the top or the bottom.
Mm. So that fits with the diagnosis that a lot of people in these regions who have whatever been the losers, what, as you may call them, of globalization are living. So that these are there's been a lot of shift towards Trump 4 years ago in these regions. Does this fit with the chart that you showed us?
Well, it's up to a point. I mean, what's happened with globalization and deindustrialization is that the industrial strength of the Democratic Party, the union strength in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, has been very much diminished. What has remained is the political strength of the small towns in the countryside, which are not losers from globalization. That's the agricultural sector, and they've always been there. For a while, they were overshadowed by the industrial position of those states. Now they're not. So it's really a pretty straightforward story. You can go back a century. You can find this division in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. It's just that the balance between the two has shifted in favor of largely in favor of the Republicans. Now, this time around, those three states went narrowly for Biden, but they're I think the long-term prospect for the Democrats in those states is not terribly good, whereas it's improving in the South, improving all across the South. You saw it happen in Georgia, the Southwest, and Arizona. And those are, and even in Texas, where things are moving in a Democratic direction, but at a pace which is not going to be decisive in the outcome of an election in the state for another 6 or 8 years.
Mm. What is the right policy for an administration to cover these two? I mean, these extremes, as you call them.
Well, from a political standpoint, the right strategy for the Democratic Party is to overcome voter suppression and to enhance voter participation with, in particular, universal mail-in balloting. This was very important in this election. The pandemic actually made a big difference. This made a substantial difference as far as anything did in favor of Biden, not because people changed their minds. As far as I can tell, they didn't change their minds at all, but because with substantially eased access to the ballot, more people turned out, and they more of them turned out actually on both sides. So the voting numbers were substantially higher than they were in 2016, but that sort of narrowly benefited the Democratic candidate this time around. And of course, that's a very big battle in the U.S. right now. Democratic Party as an institution has not been very successful or very interested in expanding voter turnout because it empowers different groups of people. You can obviously see this in Georgia, where the most famous, the most consequential American political figure who's not in office right now is a graduate of my school, the LBJ school, a former student of mine named Stacey Abrams. And what she did was without the support of the party, which was to really bring the African American and some part the Latino community in Georgia into the political process to a much greater extent than it had been there before. It showed up in the outcome in that state, which was one of the few surprises of the election.
If ever the election outcome in January would be favorable for the Democrats, how would you see the chances to get in your sense, a positive surprise, given the fact that the program that has been established at least seems very ambitious, and with trillions of dollars to be spent on climate protection, on social issues and others, that seems quite impressive, isn't it?
Sorry, what does?
If you look to the program that Joe Biden has established.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's pandemic relief, which can easily get up to the trillions of dollars. And it is essentially a question of putting checks in the pockets of households and maintaining the asset markets, which has been the job of the Federal Reserve. Does it involve to go beyond that? You need to ask, what is it that actually people are doing, and how do you make the environment of employment viable? And those are two questions which, so far as I can tell, are not, there's not really been answered. There is a traditional kind of infrastructure program, which of course has to be enacted but that's, we need to think about this in somewhat more strategic terms. There are whole sectors of the economy that are strengths of the American economy historically. Aerospace is an example. Global energy networks is an example. Construction is an example. And these things are just simply not coming back. Nobody's going to build an office building in an American city for a long time to come. I mean, it's just, there are 10% of the workforce in Manhattan is actually working in their offices at the moment. They may convert some of them into residences, but they're not building new ones. Who's going to buy a new airplane from either Boeing or Airbus, especially Boeing with its other problems? I mean, what fraction of the airworthy aircraft on the world are sitting on the ground now? This is not going to happen. So we have to think about how to redeploy those resources. I don't think that thinking's been done. Second problem is that you have practically all of the employment creation in the U.S. in the last certainly since the crisis and really for the last 30 years, has been the services. And you go to an American city and you see this all over the place. It's just full of gyms, coffee shops, restaurants, bars, and of course office workers. But those things can't operate at the current levels of capacity utilization. They can operate, but they can't stay open indefinitely. They're just running down their capital. They're running on. So you have to think about how to restructure those sectors. I know somewhat in Germany, there was some cooperative immediate assistance to essentially to cover the fixed costs of service establishments. Right now, in any town in America, what you see are boarded up storefronts. Those jobs don't come back until people feel confident about spending their incomes, and they don't feel confident about spending their incomes until they have jobs. So something has to be done, I think, along the lines of a job guarantee and a cooperative structure for services. They're not thinking yet about in those terms. And then the third big thing, which I keep harping on, is the debt structure. Everybody's debts, Americans have lots and lots of debts based upon the incomes they had before the pandemic. Yeah, those incomes have gone away. The jobs have gone away. The debts haven't gone away. They've been deferred, but they're still piling up. So something has to happen there, and that means you have consequences for the financial sector, which holds the debts. Now again, so far as I can tell, these are my big three themes. And so far as I can tell, although it is true that President-elect did speak the other day very encouragingly about the eviction foreclosure problem. Are they rolling out something on this? Maybe. I don't know. There are lots of things happen that you don't know about until they're announced, but I haven't seen it yet.
Maybe just as you're there and you know these people, could you say a word on these this economic team of Joe Biden and especially some of these? I mean, some observers said that at least there are a lot of those who have worked on inequality and how to reduce inequality. What is wrong with them?
I don't know. You have a group of personalities who are experienced. The incoming designated Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is a well-regarded labor economist and someone who's been in the arena for almost 50 years. One can go down the list of other people who are the Council of Economic Advisors is a group of advisors. It does not have significant administrative power. So it's obviously an improvement over the gang that's in there now in important ways. The head of the National Economic Council is a BlackRock veteran. People who were administrative roles in the Obama White House. Do I see them as having a vision that is going to be sufficient for the problems that they're dealing with? No, I really see them as conventional, moderate liberal economists who think in terms of stimulus programs and market adjustments. My phone is not ringing because that's not me. I don't think in those terms. I think in terms of the situations where you have structural breakdowns and you need something like the New Deal, which is a much more ambitious and institutionally oriented set of ideas. Anybody in there who has those ideas? I'm not aware of it.
Just to try again on that. Some people said that Franklin D. Roosevelt, so the president who did the New Deal at the time, hasn't been as radical, and nobody expected him to be as radical at the time. I'm not completely sure if that's true, but that's an argument that some people held to say that, well, let's see. It's often the times that bring dynamics and on, and maybe Joe Biden may be easier to do some of these bigger reforms and projects than someone who's from the left, who will be.
Well, so, no, there's always the possibility of change, although it's fair to say that when Franklin Roosevelt was Joe Biden's age, he'd been deceased for about 15 years. I wouldn't hold my breath on it. Biden's been in public life for a long time. I think he did a pretty good job in 2009 on the Obama recovery program from the, I think gets good marks for that, and maybe very much what he has in mind again. I think the circumstances are substantially more dire and require, something much larger. It's not correct to say that people who were surprised by Roosevelt weren't paying attention. Roosevelt had been governor of New York in the period of the Depression. And he had said very clearly in a book which was republished in Italy with a foreword by me called "Looking Forward" a few years ago, what he was, the major elements of what he planned to do. That was a very practically oriented administration, and it brought in every wild-eyed reformer from the American plains could find. And again, that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is a government of practiced administrators and established experts.
But didn't they? I mean, when people say these are the old, in a way, old Obama people, do you feel something like they need to reflect on why it didn't succeed when they did the job, and why there have been so many problems left? I mean, they did a good job, as you said, on rescuing the economy immediately after the financial crisis, but on all the structural issues, they weren't so good. Is there anything like, well, they are learning from what they did, or is it just going back to what they did before?
It's hard for me to judge. I think it's a group which is was broadly pleased with what they, with the final outcome of the Obama years, and not entirely without reason. I mean, it was compared to Europe, the United States did recover. And I think much of it was the fact that we have somewhat more flexible and responsive institutions, and Social Security, disability, lots of things kicked in that were there all along. In terms of whether they're taking a fundamentally different approach, again, I don't see it yet. And to the extent that they are, they're going to be hamstrung by the fact that their ability to get things through Congress will be very, very. The political atmosphere is deeply poisoned in the United States, and the fact that the Democrats gave essentially no assistance. I mean, when Trump came in, he was already toxic to the Democrats. So when he was talking about infrastructure and so forth, he got nothing from either side. The Republicans weren't interested. The Democrats who would have been beneficiaries weren't interested. And so it's easily possible you'll see a continuing, ongoing internal civil war that will prevent anything very substantial from happening.
There are two questions. Maybe I can ask Vinit Rishi first. Would you ask the question directly, or should I read it?
Go ahead and ask them directly. I'll try to pick up on my hearing is very defective, so I apologize for that.
No problem. Vinit, are you?
Yeah, should I ask the question then?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Flip on your video so I can, I can be like George H.W. Bush and read your lips if necessary.
I can't. I'm not allowed to by the host.
You should. I mean,
it says I can't.
All right, well, just go ahead.
So sorry about that. Thank you for the talk. So you mentioned that none of the more progressive left voices have been included. They generally represent the younger Democrat voters, I believe, that rallied around Bernie Sanders. And then, of course, there are others in Congress that represent those voices. So why have none of those voices been included in this administration? I mean, it almost confirms this idea of the Washington insiders have come back into this administration, that there's no real, there's no real change here.
That's precisely what did happen. And you have to, I mean, it's just a fact that the dislike between these two wings of the Democratic Party is just as great as the dislike between the Democrats and the Republicans, maybe greater in some respects. And so what happened here was that after the collapse of the Sanders campaign in February, March, around Super Tuesday, there was a period in which people made nice, and Bernie certainly put every effort into ensuring, as he promised he would, that everybody would pull together to defeat Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, the incoming team is no use for anybody who was involved with Sanders or any part of the left of the Democratic Party. Simply none. And in fact, the appointment of Neera Tanden to be the head of the OMB, with Sanders as either the ranking or the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Tanden was a absolutely toxic opponent of Sanders on the social media, the detractor of Sanders. So they're clearly sending a message that this is their show and they don't want the left to do anything other than to fall in line. And in fact, their left is such that there's obviously some voices who are going to come along in future years, but it has no organized existence at the present time, none.
Thank you.
Next question, Veronica Pohr.
Thank you. So actually, my question is following the question of Vinit. So it's really good that we are one after each other, because my question was mostly that, okay, so the progressive left wasn't really included, isn't really included, but then what can we do? So what can the progressive left do to work against inequality during Biden's administration? So what can the people do? How could they organize? What are your recommendations there?
It's an excellent question, and I would answer it basically in terms of the major issues that one has to address. And there are three or so that come to mind that I think are really critical. The first of all is the pandemic itself and the necessity for some degree of social and economic reorganization, which I've already basically spoken to, the three major points. That's been my objective. Secondly, of course, there's a climate crisis. And one thing that progressives can do here is to, first of all, to point out the ways in which fundamentally you need to have real rather than artificial solutions to the decarbonization problem. You can't simply say, okay, we're going to have some fantasy technology like carbon capture that's going to come in and make it possible to make a smooth transition. You have to build, in fact, upon what's already happening, which is the decline in commuting, the decline in the use of office space, and all these energy using activities, which down substantially. How do you build that into the future of the structure of the American economy, so you don't go back to your previous patterns, which were obviously generated a lot more in the way of greenhouse gases. That's just one step that you can take, but it seems to me that progressives can develop their ideas along those lines. And the third thing has to do with sort of social solidarity. And there, I'm very taken by Albena Asmanova's arguments about the fundamental issue being insecurity, precarity, not so much inequality. Inequality is an instrument or a symptom, but what we really need to protect and defend and expand are those programs of social insurance and health insurance and old age insurance and disability and unemployment that basically sheltered the society from much worse consequences, and which are perpetually under attack. And one of the great dangers of having a Democratic administration in the U.S. is that you can then get compromisers who say, Republicans have always been ready to take after these New Deal programs. If they can get a Democrat to provide some cover, then much worse things happen. Typically, when the Republicans are in charge, the Democrats rally behind their traditions. When the Democrats are in charge, then you tend to get some more of the Wall Street view slipped in. We're constantly fighting this. We were fighting it under Clinton, than under Obama. Won't be surprised if we fight it again, have to fight it again under Biden rather.
Thanks. Christian Schütte.
Yes, hello. You seem to be very pessimistic, but I think one major difference, say, from the Obama years is that now there's a broad consensus in the economic profession and also in Wall Street, mainstream establishment, that you actually can and should run massive deficits for a long period of time. Shouldn't this affect the outlook? I mean, there may be some resistance on the part of the Republicans for political reasons, but it seems to me that the establishment now is very much in favor of massive.
You muted yourself in the last thing, but yeah, just to take up the point. Of course, the Republicans, who are more Keynesian than Keynes when they're in power, become the pillars of fiscal rectitude as soon as a Democrat takes office. So we have it, that is already established phenomenon. It's not news. And they're already talking up the terrible burden of the federal debt on our children and grandchildren, yada, yada, yada. It's utterly transparent, but somehow there are elements of the press that fall for it every time. As far as the Democrats are concerned, one has, it's true that you have a kind of shift of some of the most influential figures amongst the economists, the Democratic Party, Larry Summers, Jason Furman, and so forth, who are saying now, of course, with the interest rates so low, this is a great moment for doing a lot of infrastructure spending, long-term borrowing, et cetera, and that's a constructive statement. But the argument, which I actually did address in a little note that I published on the Institute for New Economic Thinking site a few days ago, is it's incoherent, and it leaves open the possibility. First of all, leaves open the possibility of a pivot later on, as happened in the Obama administration. Say, okay, now we've done that, and we need to offset by being more austere. And they leave a big window open for this assumption that Social Security and Medicare need something called reform, which is almost always based upon misleading forecasts, and basically it's an approach which says, oh, we're going to have to cut down benefits in the near future so that we don't have to cut them in the far future. Insurance schemes are insurance schemes. They can be supported, but these two actually are the pillars of the protection of the elderly Americans from poverty, which has been one of the great social successes of the last half century, reduction in poverty rates amongst the elderly, but constantly under attack from people who are basically connected to the financial interests, insurance companies, and so on. So I suppose I'm in the camp of trust but verify on the shift from of the people I mentioned, and people I think you're referring to, and will it make a difference in terms of getting things through the Congress? The problem here is that when you do a major infrastructure program, what you're doing basically is rebuilding cities. Making them more livable. Republicans don't live in cities. Mitch McConnell couldn't care less what happens outside of the constituencies that he represents. And so the problem here is there's a complete lack of national purpose, a shared national purpose in the Congress. And I don't see how that's going to be remedied.
Thanks. Next question, Mark Adam.
Yeah, thank you. So I dropped out for a minute, so I'm not sure if we have touched on trade policy yet, but what do you think will be the future of US trade policy? I mean, the Democrats, since at least Bill Clinton, has been very trade liberal. And when we talk about the Green New Deal or New Deal, what happened under Roosevelt was sort of this this shift towards more preferential trade agreements or reorientation of trade policy, or that also set the stage for the post-World War II trade order, international trade order. So I'm wondering, how do you see the future of US trade policy to play out, especially within the US-China trade relationship, which now the Democrats must have realized was very important in the success of Donald Trump, but also the trade relations with the EU, and what role maybe Brexit plays as a player between those two blocs. Yeah, thanks.
The answer to your question is I honestly don't know. We're clearly, I think, not going to see new trade deals. I think that they've been pretty clear that this is not something that's on the priority by any means. And to the extent that we do, the negotiators will have labor and environmental considerations considerably more prominently featured than was the case in the previous round of deals. But what will happen with respect to the relationship with China, I think it's an open question at this point. I think what the president-elect has said is that he's going to reassess. And that's a way of saying we're going to leave that one off not removing the Trump tariffs immediately, not removing the various sanctions, leaving it open to be reconsidered at a future time. I think some of the Democratic Party doesn't have, well, I won't even say, I was going to say that, quite the same hostility, but as far as I can tell, actually, it's very similar. Hostility toward China is a competitive issue in the United States, in American politics. And there's just no political benefit to appearing softer than the other side, even if that's your basic inclination. So unless there's some real change in the political climate, and I don't see how it can happen. I mean, it obviously happened in the 1970s when Kissinger and Nixon went to China. It was an overnight change. And that kind of thing is very, very difficult to replicate, and takes a degree of political imagination that we haven't seen in this country for a long time. Well, maybe apart from Donald Trump's meetings with Kim Jong-un. But in any event, it doesn't seem to me to be very likely to be a feature of the Biden administration. The best we can hope for, if you're interested, as I am, in calmer relations with other major powers, is that these topics simply recede a little bit from the front burner of American political discussion.
Thanks.
As you've been referring to your piece on the website of INET, I was quite interested and puzzled by some of your arguments, and maybe we can just switch to that, because it's not only US, but it's also relevant for Europe in a way. If I understand correctly, your argument was to say that, contrary to what many economists now say, low interest rates do not really have a structural reason. It's mainly because of central banks doing it. Did I understand correctly? And then I would also have tended to say that in Europe, many people say that's the bad ECB in Germany, the bad ECB that is lowering interest rates, and it's bad for people, and so on and so on. I mean, don't need to argue on that, but one argument often heard, and I would argue, was to say, well, now it's not only the ECB, it's for structural reasons. So could you just elaborate shortly on your argument why interest rates, there's no structural reason?
Well, the short-term interest rate, the one that the central bank controls in all of the major what we call financially sovereign countries of the world, countries that pay their own debts in their own currencies, is an administered rate. And when the central bank sets it at zero, that's where it goes. And that was true for the European Central Bank, true for the Bank of England, true for the Federal Reserve. Now, the issue that's being discussed is what happens to those longer term rates on government securities, treasury bond rates, 10 years, 20 years, and so forth. And there's a, this is where this notion of loanable funds still creeps in. It's an obsolete notion from, was associated with Keynes's opponent, Dennis Robertson, in the 1930s. But the reality of this, of the long Treasury bond market, is that the Treasury long bonds are a substitute for short bonds. And you pay people a little more interest and they hold a longer bond. But when the short rate is very, very low and has been for a long time, the long bond follows it down. And then it becomes a situation in which the central bank is essentially trapped. It can't lower the short rate below zero, although obviously in some situations that has been done. They can't lower it very much below zero. And it can't raise it above or even that close to the long rate without causing havoc in the financial markets. And everybody then only wants to lend to on the short end of the government market. And so at that point, you have a kind of cleft stick in the central bank, which has been true in the United States for years and years. It keeps talking about raising rates down the road and keeps sending these little signals. But whenever it moves a little bit in that direction, bad things happen and they retreat. And that's been a pattern for a long, long time. So my view is that the central bank has other instruments. It can buy up private debt, which it has been doing to support the price of private bonds. But nobody else wants them. But that its interest rate policy has been kind of locked into a low interest equilibrium, from which it's very hard for me to see how it gets out. The last time that we had this sort of major breakout of this kind was in the late 1970s under Paul Volcker, with deeply catastrophic consequences for the world economy that went on for 15 or 20 years. I simply don't see that happening again. So there we are. It is clearly, the short answer is the interest rate is a monetary phenomenon. It is influenced by central bank policy and by and the long end by behavior of financial investors in the money markets, but it's not a relationship between a supply of savings and a demand for loans. If a sovereign government does not have any trouble financing its debts, even if the interest rate is substantially higher. Reagan never did. Reagan had 20% interest rates. The Treasury never had any trouble financing its bonds. And huge deficits, no trouble. It's not a problem in the way the monetary systems are set up. And people who argue otherwise are working off of a model which has been out of date for almost a century.
Which is true for these big countries like the US and others.
Yeah, you can look up my debate with Stephanie Kelton on my team, and the other one was headed by Ottmar Issing on Bloomberg it was aired on the 4th of December. Check it out. We had a nice discussion of this.
Sounds like an interesting debate. As we're approaching the end of the talk, I would very much like to hear something. What do you consider will be the future beyond the next 4 years? I mean, I want to ask the question, what does America need to win against Trumpism and discontent and anything that explains these difficult times? So what should be done, and when this is not done in the next couple of years, what will happen afterwards with America's society?
Well, it's an important and troubling question. I think the first thing that we need to somehow overcome is the feeling of mutual contempt, which is now splitting apart the country. And it's as much a problem on the Democratic side as the Republican side. There's been a kind of poisoning of the well that goes back to the way in which Trump's victory was greeted by the Democrats, and is certainly showing up in the way Biden's victory is being greeted by Trump voters. In terms of how this plays out, I think both parties have severe problems. The Republicans may well how they resolve their leadership problem in the post-Trump era and deal with his legacy is going to be a very interesting challenge for them. And one possibility is a very hard right, internationally aggressive, domestically kind of essentially fascist tendency, which is certainly emerging in some parts of the Republican Party. In terms of how the Democrats transform themselves, they're going to have a big challenge because at the moment the party has no base in the no real reach to the regions or the populations that were predominantly for Trump. And they may be able to hold on to power by essentially demographic shift in their direction over time. But I wouldn't count on it. And I wouldn't count on the two sides coming to some kind of an accommodation unless you have a real breakthrough of institutional changes which align political interests in a different way. That means you really have to achieve things and show people that you can achieve them. And at the moment, we're not one among the countries that are achieving things. We can't deal with this pandemic in an effective way. And that's going to be a long-standing problem. Whereas if you look around the world, you look at Asia, and you see, well, there are places which are showing a great deal more solidarity. And I think you'll just see the relative standing of the United States affected by that.
Is there something you would recommend at first and most important for Democrats to achieve people again and in these regions that you're talking about?
The first and probably most important thing is to deal with the debts. Then you have a real creditor-debtor situation, and you need to keep people in their homes, and you need to give them some degree of security that they don't have now. That means you have to sacrifice some benefits for the financial classes who made all those loans. That would be, in terms of what you can do to kind of reset the political environment. I think you could ease the situation substantially by moving in that direction and within the power of the government to do that. So if I had to pick one thing that, that wasn't a long-term, okay, let's redo the energy grid and fix the climate problem, which is a proposition of enormous complexity, something that you could put forward quickly and begin to make some progress on. It's that you can get people back into homes and off the streets and so forth, and then give them some degree of assurance that they're not going to be dispossessed by the pandemic.
Very interesting, very good point. Thank you very much, James. We are having the hour done now. It's our rule that we are doing it quick in 1 hour. That was very interesting, very thought-provoking. And I mean, even if you're not the most optimistic on the chances to see that Green Deal coming, maybe that's history. That's something which is evolving and people are thinking about it and it's going back to some point. And but I mean,
we have to keep arguing for what we believe in. And I want to thank you all for joining us. And just say a quick hello to my friend Laszlo Andor, who I see is here, and anybody else I happen to have encountered before. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll come back to that question in a couple of months and see what is happening. So thanks a lot to Texas, and have a good day and take care. Thanks to everyone